OBS says reconnection successful. Still getting 0. Waiting for it to pull back up. Don't know what's going on with the internet right now.
Oh, we're back on Twitch.
Yeah. So, we were talking about easy modes and suggestions.
Yeah. Are we going to come back up on YouTube or not? I guess.
It says we're online. On my end, at least.
Well, anyway, we're back on Twitch. So, yes. So someone on. Oh, okay. Yeah. Hold on. Copy link address. Here. YouTube link. There we go. So we are back up on YouTube.
Yeah, I see it. Hey, you know what? I can't help the fact that freaking they're digging up mains and stuff like that all over town and screwing up with everybody's connections to everything.
So anyway, somebody I know on Twitter that I didn't want to argue with suggested that boss battles should be skippable.
Yeah.
And that, I guess they get stuck on boss battles.
A lot of people do. My mom used to ask me to beat the bosses for her.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's an interesting, I guess the question is, and this is sort of related to the easy mode question, is should you be able to experience an entire game from beginning to end without getting good?
No.
Is the question.
I would just outright say no.
Yeah.
And I actually can have a real world anecdote of two different
Well, I was
times,
trying to think.
Two different
I was trying to think
of
an analogy.
Right? No, I didn't even need an analogy. Anecdotes, right? Of this exact case, right? I know two different people that have benefited more from this. My mom, being one of them, used to have me and my brothers beat boss battles for her if she took more than 2 tries to try to do it or whatever. And at first I would do it for her so she could continue, even though sometimes the boss battle is actually easier than some of the puzzles and stuff that you did prior to it. But I think it's the stress of it being the boss of the dungeon that gets some people too, even if it's easier than things you did earlier in the dungeon. But I would do it for her. And then one day I got older. I was like, I'm not doing this for you anymore. Right. So then she would move on to my younger brother. And he was the same until he just wasn't in the house anymore. And then she'd move on to the youngest. And then he did the same thing. And then at one day, everyone's just like, we're not beating it for you. How do you even get past the rest of the game if we keep doing this stuff for you? And she slowly, mad, angry at us, saying oh, you don't love me, freaking disrespectful child and stuff like that. Yeah,
beat it yourself.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But she would slowly. No, she's beaten more games. She used to not even finish games before. Sometimes she'd get she'd stop at the last boss and stuff. She's finished more games and enjoys games more now than back when we would beat the bosses for her. And I even had a friend in high school that was very similar. He really liked Zelda games. He liked Final Fantasy like I did. We had a lot of similar tastes when it came to video games. And a lot of times what he would do is he would play the game for a little bit, and then he'd start struggling once, right? And here, just beat the boss for me. And he's like, I didn't mind doing it. We were all hanging out. We were it was we'd spend the weekends at this place. So it's okay, we're all playing the game together. And I'd beat the boss, and then I'd be so into it, I'd forget, and he would never take the controller back. He was just more content watching me play the game. So he actually never really finished games himself prior to that. And I think Final Fantasy 15 was the first game that he played all the way through by himself since high school, maybe even since middle school. And he had a really fun time, and I think he had, from what I remember, he enjoyed the game more than he did any of the games that we played together back in high school. And I think if you actually take the time to get better at this stuff, you get more enjoyment out of it, because that's what the game's designed to do, is to give you a challenge you can overcome.
Yeah. Says his grandmother had trouble driving a car. To me, the boss. I mean, so here's the thing. There's obviously better design. There's some games are better designed than others.
For sure.
And so some games do boss battles better than others. So I can understand if someone gets frustrated with a game that's just poorly designed. But most of the time, and with a well-designed game, the boss battles tend to bring together. So, typically with game design, there's an increasing difficulty curve.
Yeah.
And what happens is the boss battle, if it's well designed, it's a bit of a spike. But what the idea is you pull together all the stuff you learned to get there.
And often it's just between the two bosses, too. Sometimes the stuff before, but often it's like everything in this section, this boss is going to test you on.
Yeah, between the last boss and the current one. Yeah, so, oftentimes I find the boss battles to be the most interesting part of the game.
Oh, yeah.
Especially in things like Final Fantasy, for instance. Final Fantasy has a lot of grinding, at least, the old ones, has a lot of grinding where, you might use a spell or two, but especially as you grind more and more, eventually you get strong enough that you can just hit and just get through it as quickly as possible. And then you get to a boss, and that's where the real strategy comes in. And you think, okay, I need to cast haste, I need to cast temper, I need to cast protect, all this stuff, and all this stuff that you may not ever do hardly in just sort of a random fight. And I mean, mini bosses are also helpful in that area where it's kind of like a pop quiz. Like, what have you learned to this point? Okay, it's not going to be that hard, but it is going to be helpful for you to use all these spells and abilities that you may not be using on a regular basis. And then you get to a big boss, and it's like, okay, now we're really going to test you here. And a lot of times it's the same with action games. I mean, you look at the Lionels in Breath of the Wild. Those you could sort of consider as boss battles, and it's like you're fighting all these.
A better example, probably going back to Ocarina of Time, right, where you've got a dungeon that's set up as a puzzle, right, and you'll get items in the dungeon. And you'll probably need to use the item you get in the dungeon to fight the boss. You'll probably also need to use it to fight the mid-boss you fight, like, right after getting the item or whatever. And it'll be like, they'll give you these tests throughout the dungeon. And maybe sometimes the tests are harder than the boss, because the boss will be a combination of those tests. But those things just combine so well that it's like, oh, well, this was easy to adapt to. Sometimes it's not so much. But they'll give you a test, and you have to overcome that test. You have to learn how to hop a gap or something like that. It's like, oh, well, if I just run off at this angle, it'll hop properly. Or I have to hit this thing with a hammer or whatever. And then you'll learn all these things. And then by the time you fight the boss, you'll be like, oh, well, I know I can swing the dragon's head with the hammer, like the second it pops out of the ground or whatever. And it'll just be like this culmination of everything you did in that dungeon. And I think that, like, that's a really good way to design a level. Like, that's good level design where it's like, we're going to teach you this stuff through challenges, and then we're going to test you on those challenges afterwards.
Yeah, I think Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess both do that very well.
Yeah.
Where the final boss is sort of a test of what you've learned.
Link to the Past.
Some Zelda games. What's that?
Link to the Past as well. They'll use the items in the dungeon a lot, and then it's like, oh well, now I got to use the hook shot against this boss that I used throughout the dungeon. Yeah,
some Zelda games I find the bosses to be. I mean, a lot of Zelda games, the bosses are just way too easy.
Yes. And
don't really test your skills enough, or don't test your skills with a certain weapon, whatever you got in the dungeon. So I think sometimes the bosses in Zelda are way too easy. But I mean, the reason I brought up Lionel's is because that's more of a test of your skills. There's not a particular weapon that that you have to use against them. It's more a test of how good you've gotten. And things like Eventide Island in Breath of the Wild.
I think that's a better challenge because, to be honest, I think the Lionels are designed poorly in Breath of the Wild. Yeah, they're not horrible. I think they're just like right below the average line. They're just kind of like tipping there because there's certain things about the
too hard,
Lionels.
too easy.
It's not that they're too hard. I think they're too janky at times.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And it's mostly the way the targeting works on the ones that can spit the fireball. Even if you jump sometimes, it'll auto-correct on the targeting and you'll get hit anyway, even though like it was designed for you to dodge it that way. I've seen it happen to people several times. And also I've seen people get out of the way of the explosion roar and still take damage from it. So they're like, the hitbox on it is not as precise as it looks. It's just below the line. Well,
those are technical.
Yeah, but they hurt the challenge when there's a technical problem like that. If things aren't as designed, then the challenge doesn't work properly sometimes. Yeah. I don't think it's too bad though. It's just minor criticism.
So I can understand some things. I mean, some of the enemies, like some of the bosses or some of the mini bosses in like Super Metroid, can be a little bit frustrating, I think.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. If a game designer decides to do something like, if you die in a boss fight, I think it's always good for it to be able to start you right before that fight.
Checkpoints.
Which, for instance,
checkpoints are great.
Yeah. Even if you didn't explicitly save right before that, for instance, like Samus Returns. Samus Returns has some really tough boss fights, but if you die in them, you start at the door right before you went in, even if there was no save point. You just start right there, and that's awesome.
It can be.
Well, I mean, I think it's nice to be able to, like,
I think it depends.
Okay, I want to try that again. Yeah. Well, I mean.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice feature where you want to say, I want to try it right again. I know what I did wrong. I don't want to have to go through all this stuff to just get there again. I just want to try it again.
Well, and also a game that's like maybe generally aimed at a child audience. Maybe not little kids, but just like most Nintendo games are aimed at 10-year-olds. I think is like the average age they're looking for there. That's fine, right? Like, but a game like Dark Souls, I think if you started right there before the boss instead of like at whatever the last bonfire was and you had to work, part of the game is this whole trial and error and memorizing things on the way, and it's aimed for a more mature audience. I think you would actually devalue the game. So it's all contextual. Like, I wouldn't complain about it in Metroid, but I would complain about it in like a Souls game.
And sometimes, like, you might not want to, like, you might not be able to beat the boss because you're just not prepared, and so you need to go and do other things first anyway.
Which is why I always liked the like people like autosaves and stuff now and checkpoints. Certain games like Final Fantasy, I liked that you had to manually save all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that when you die, you return back to your last manual save. I think it's a mechanic that works for a game like that, especially where it's like you control your level of difficulty in an RPG based on how much you grind, right? If you go in at the bare minimum level you need to fight something, like a little under-leveled, it's a challenge, but you might be able to pull it off, and you might be able to get through the game quicker. If you go at exact level that they tell you, it's supposed to be like par for the course. It might be a little challenging, but you could definitely handle it. You may not sweat. If you go in over-leveled in an RPG, well, then you just basically activated easy mode, but you earned it because you spent all that time grinding to get easy mode on a boss. Like, I think that's a fair way of doing it, and when you have a system like that, manual saves are totally the way to go. They work for RPGs. For platformers and stuff, though, like that, and Metroid is very much a platformer as a combat game, I think autosaves and stuff like that and checkpoints are great. Because a platformer is all about the mechanics of what you did to get there. If you already were able to get there, you shouldn't have to do it again.
And then there's certain games where there is no grinding to do. It's like totally skill. And I think, although I have not played it, I think Cuphead is kind of like that.
Yeah.
Where it's just like,
but you
know, it just gets...
there are checkpoints as long as you have lives. But lives don't, like, restart the game. You have to start a level from the beginning if you run out in most state. I think there are many levels, though, that if you make it to the halfway point, you can always restart the level from the halfway point in Cuphead. But that's like the same thing I'm saying with the checkpoints, right? Like a platformer. And Cuphead is a platformer. It's just an action platformer with shooting and stuff. Anything that's skill-based, I'm fine with checkpoints because you already mastered enough of the skill to get to the checkpoint. You shouldn't have to re-demonstrate that skill again. Yeah.
But my point is, for those kinds of games where it's like there's no way that you can go back and get better other than just getting better at playing, you know, what do you think about games with that, like, gradually decrease the difficulty every time you die?
I don't like
that. I feel like that is a reasonable option if it gives you that option.
Well, yeah, I'm not hardline because I can think of plenty of games where adapted difficulty is fine, right?
Yeah.
Especially rhythm games. I think certain types of rhythm games adapted difficulty can be really good for. Especially one if a sequence can get harder because you're doing better. Space Channel 5, I think, is a good example of it, where it's not like truly adaptive in a case, but it's got different sequences depending on how well you did in the sequences before that it'll change to, so it's still adaptive difficulty in that sense. There are certain games where it's great to have adaptive difficulty. I think a game like Cuphead, though, where like Cuphead, the whole point of it is like a challenge, right? That adaptive difficulty can actually hurt the game.
Yeah.
But then there's like a game like what's the name of it? Is it Godfist? I think is which is a Clover Studio game, where same people made Beautiful Joe and stuff. The studio that became Platinum later on when Kamiya went out of Capcom. But so like Godfist has a level for your character, and it starts at level 0, and 0 is basically easy. It's the easiest the game's gonna get. The better you do, the more people you kill and you don't take damage, the difficulty level of the game goes up and you get better rewards for that. But the game gets harder and you take damage, it'll fall back down. So the whole game is adaptive difficulty in that case. And it really works for what they designed the game. And that's an action like beat 'em up game. So it depends on what you're trying to accomplish with the game, but there are times where adaptive difficulty is good.
So I think the bottom line is, the original question was being able to completely skip boss fights. I think considering all the different options, all the different options we just discussed, I think it would be lazy game design and lazy game playing. You know, it's like there's so many other ways.
Oh, did Rick just hop in to advertise?
Of course he did. So anyway, I totally disagree with the person, the friend, who I think just happened to have a bad take on boss fights, that they should not be skippable.
In fact, what I think
that they're typically an integral part of the game. And
for sure.
Sometimes the best part of it.
I think more games need to pull a Devil May Cry 3, where you can have difficulty modes. I'm fine with games having difficulty modes. I don't think that's actually a problem. Some games, like when people request that Dark Souls should have an easy mode, I'm like, fuck yourself. If the game itself is only designed to be a challenge, you shouldn't have difficulty modes. But I'm fine if a developer wants to put difficulty modes, put them in. Devil May Cry 3 is always the best example because it starts out with only 2 options, normal and hard, right? And then the first time you die, doesn't matter how long it takes you through the game, the very first time you die in Devil May Cry 3, the game shames you. And it says easy mode is now available.
No.
Yeah. So you can go back, you can fight the boss on easy mode too. You can progress through the whole game. But beating it on easy mode doesn't unlock the story on the harder difficulties. You actually have to replay through every mission on a harder difficulty. Beating it, I believe beating it on a harder difficulty has it complete on all the easier difficulties, but to do it on a harder one, you have to re-go up to that spot on the more difficult version. And that's the way a game should be. It's like you can always go down the difficulty, but if you want to go back to continuing the game on normal mode or hard mode, you have to go back to where you stopped, and you have to pick the game back up from there. I think that's a fine way of doing it.
I think people need to realize video games are not movies. And
what if you did easy mode to beat a boss, and the section after the boss was harder, and you went back to normal mode, and now you can't beat the section after the boss? I think that would actually be bad game design.
Yeah. And I think people feel very entitled to like experience the whole game without doing anything.
No, you didn't actually experience it.
That's a movie. That's a book. That's
watch a Let's Play.
Comic book or something. Yeah, watch a Let's Play. That's not how games work. Like, if you don't like that aspect of games, then maybe you don't like games. So there's nothing wrong with not liking games, but like...
Or maybe you just don't like playing games, which is also nothing wrong. You can culturally like games. I think Let's Playing is great. Like, I don't fault my friend back in high school for sitting there and watching me play the games. To some degree, I think, even though he enjoys playing games more now that he's actually beaten some and stuff and he's doing it on his own, I think in total he enjoys watching games more than he likes playing it, and that's perfectly fine.
I have never beaten the original Castlevania, probably never will. I don't even like the game. I don't like playing it. But I love watching people play it, and I've watched people play it from beginning to end. I very much enjoy that. But I will never beat it, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
it's like I just don't like it.
I think gaming is a spectator's activity. Like it can be a spectator's hobby. I know a lot of people who would just sit on the couch with their friends as they play, and they would talk about the game. Like I would talk about the game with people while I'm sitting there playing it. It's a social thing. You don't have to be the one playing it, and I think that's why like streaming is so popular, because it's a social thing. You don't have to be the one beating the game. You don't feel bad if the game's too hard for you.
Yeah. No, I've never beaten the N64 Castlevania. I did used to own it, but I will never beat it. That's just a bad game.
I can't beat through the Fire and Flames on expert mode in Guitar Hero. I mean, maybe if I tried hard enough and I put that effort in, I could, but I don't desire to. I love watching my younger brother beat through the Fire and Flames on expert mode in Guitar Hero 3. And that's, again, it's a perfectly valid mode of operation.
Yeah. But no, don't make boss battles skippable. That's just dumb.
Yeah. That's the verdict. That's the show. We were a little over. Thank you all for watching or listening at any point in the future. If you enjoy the show, please share it with somebody else who likes it. If you really enjoy the show, please consider giving a donation to streamlabs.com/vomitoriumlive. Apparently, our hosting fees have been met because Marsupial decided to give a donation at the beginning of the show. Thanks for that. But any amount helps. We can go over. It helps us do other things. Or it also rolls over into the next month, even though I do have to reset the little bar every single time. So please consider supporting the show, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
See ya.